Today we have a very special pistol, and not just because of who owned it before me. This is a Clark Custom Guns 38 Special long slide that used to belong to James Earl Jones, most famous for being the voice of Darth Vader. But when's the last time you saw or even heard of a 1911 chambered in 38 Special? And what if I told you the man that built it was incredibly interesting in his own right? Not only was he an extremely important figure in the development of the modern 1911, he was also the first civilian ever to win the NRA National Pistol Championships, and he's also the father-in-law of Jerry Miculek.
I am your father.
Growing up, of course, I loved Star Wars, and I don't think there's a more iconic character in Star Wars than Darth Vader. I think the first time I ever saw James Earl Jones on screen would have been in Dr. Strangelove. Of course, he's been in countless other films, many voice acting roles, The Lion King, and so on. So this pistol is very cool in that aspect, but I've been wanting one of these pistols in this particular configuration from this particular era of Clark Custom Guns for several reasons. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll share or at least appreciate some of my enthusiasm for it. So first, let's talk about why this pistol exists. The 38 Special 1911 comes from the world of American Bullseye, which is also referred to as three-gun competition. When Bullseye was refined into its current iteration around the mid to late 1930s, it was meant to be the synthesis of the civilian shooter's 22 caliber pistol, the police officer's 32 or 38 caliber revolver, and the military man's 45 caliber automatic. And traditionally, that's how the sport was shot for many years, especially during the early years on through the 1940s and 1950s. Of course, one major disadvantage that the revolver had in the center fire or 38 caliber match, which is 1/3 of all the shots fired in a traditional three-gun bullseye match, was that you had to manually thumb cock the hammer in rapid fire or possess incredible trigger control in double action. In the rapid fire stage of Bullseye, you're trying to shoot 5 shots into a 3.3-inch circle at 25 yards in a time limit of 10 seconds, and you're doing that one-handed. I can tell you from personal experience that 10 seconds is almost exactly the amount of time it takes to make 5 well-aimed, non-predictive shots while manually cocking the hammer to fire in single action. So the revolver in rapid fire was always cutting it close in terms of time, but the advantage that the revolver had was that the commonly used 38 Special wad cutter produced very little recoil, it was very accurate, and in the early years of the sport, these revolvers were mechanically much more accurate than what could be achieved at the time with 45 automatics. As the sport entered the late 1940s with the work at Springfield Armory on the US government issue National Match 1911s, as well as the work of several gunsmiths like John Giles, R.L. Shockey, Jim Clark, among others, the 1911 had been refined to where they eventually achieved parity with revolvers in terms of mechanical accuracy. Once these gunsmiths and engineers figured out how to make an accurate 1911, it didn't take them long to start experimenting with modifying 38 Super 1911s to feed the 38 Special wad cutter. The 38 Special 1911 was ultimately meant to combine the advantages and speed of the automatic pistol with the light recoil and supreme accuracy of the 38 Special wad cutter. For context, I should add that at this time, the 38 Special cartridge was the most popular centerfire handgun cartridge in America. It was very easy to find, very high quality, extremely accurate 38 Special wad cutters, and they weren't prohibitively expensive. 38 Special was far more popular than 38 Super Automatic, and it's hard to imagine today, but in the late 40s, even into the 1960s, the 9mm Luger cartridge barely had a footprint in the American market. And unlike 38 Super and 9mm Luger, 38 Special already had an excellent reputation of being a very accurate cartridge, and it was able to maintain that accuracy at much lower velocities. Compared to a standard 9mm or 38 Super loading, or especially a 45 automatic loading, a 38 Special wad cutter meant you had an extremely accurate cartridge with significantly less recoil. This particular example of a 38 Special 1911 was made by James E. Clark Sr. in May of 1972, which is marked under the slide. While 38 Special conversions of the 1911 go back to the early 1950s, according to this excerpt from the Gil Hebert catalog, Clark Custom long slides represent the latest in a series of successful target guns for discerning targetmen. For the princely sum of $263.50 in 1967, you'd be guaranteed a pistol with a mechanical accuracy of 2 inches or less at 50 yards from a machine rest, a 2.5 to 2 3/4 pound trigger pull, a sight radius of 8 1/4 inches, and a total weight of 44 ounces. Test targets, instructions, recommended loads, and written guarantee furnished with every gun. An interesting thing to note there is that this accuracy guarantee is actually a 1/4 inch better than the equivalent 45 caliber long slide that Clark also offered. So let's take a close look at just how James Clark managed to make this pistol. The heart of this conversion lies in the barrel. This started life as a 38 Super barrel that had the rifled section removed and the 38 Super chamber bored out, leaving just the upper and lower lugs. A Douglas 6-inch 38 Special barrel and chamber would then be inserted into the remaining stock and silver soldered in place. You can see the lines where this barrel has been sleeved into what remained of the original 38 Super barrel. You can also see a small cutout on the bottom of the barrel that interfaces with a bump in the frame that was built up with a bead of weld. This modification, to the best of my knowledge, first appeared on the Colt 38 Special mid-range pistols, which were Colt's own factory-produced 38 Special 1911s introduced in the early 1960s. This bump is a small extension of the frame's feed ramp so that the flat face of the wad cutter has less chance to catch on the bottom lip of where the barrel meets the frame and helps literally bump the cartridge into the chamber. Of course, this modification predates the ramped barrel, and presumably it was a positive development, as we can see James Clark integrate this into his builds by the time this pistol was converted in 1972. The breech face of the slide also had to be opened up to accept the wider base of the 38 Special case, and the extractor was also modified to accept the much larger rim. The next most important part of this conversion is the magazine. In the early days, 38 Super magazines would be converted to hold and feed 38 Special wad cutters. Here I have a modified magazine, and you can see where the feed lips have been bent inwards and outwards to grab the case at 2 points. The rear portion grabs the rim of the 38 Special case, and the forward section applies pressure on the sides of the case to make sure it doesn't want to wander left or right. As soon as the rim clears the short section of feed lips in the rear, the case pops up out of the magazine. The next development of the magazines came again with the development of Colt's factory 38 Special 1911 in the 1960s, and their 38 Special kit guns, which were introduced around the same time, and were essentially unfinished pistols that would be sold to gunsmiths to be fit into completed match pistols. With these factory 38 Special 1911s, Colt also developed a purpose-built 38 Special magazine, and according to pretty much everyone out there that's familiar with 38 Special 1911s, the Colt factory 38 Special magazines are by far the best option when it comes to reliable feeding of the 38 wad cutter cartridge. Today, these magazines are quite rare and are worth quite a lot. There are some third-party magazines out there with a similar design, but they do not have a great reputation. So that's most of the 38 Special specific aspects of this pistol. Now let's take a look at some of the more general aspects, because there's a lot of really cool old school gunsmithing going on here that you just don't see anymore. So the frame rails of this pistol have been welded up and machined back down to a very close fit with the slide. The slide to frame fit of this pistol is still very good to this day. Going back to the barrel, you can see some discoloration on the lower lugs, where Jim Clark again welded them up and recut them so that the lower lugs actually lock up on the slide stop pin. The barrel hood would have also been welded up and refit to ensure very little fore and aft movement of the barrel in the locked position. Lastly, a tightly fit bushing would be machined and fit to the slide and barrel, which would support the muzzle end of the barrel. Barrel fitment and, to a lesser degree, slide to frame fitment are the most critical steps of building an accurate 1911. And before oversized or gunsmith fit barrels, frames, and slides were common or readily available, the way these pistols would be accurized was by welding them up oversized and then cutting them back down into spec. This is actually how Jim Clark Sr. invented the long slide 1911. This extra inch of slide actually comes from another 1911 slide. At some point in the 1950s, Jim Clark purchased an oil drum of decommissioned 1911 slides from some kind of government surplus outlet. These slides were decommissioned by being torch cut in half. That meant the entire front end of the slide was still perfectly intact, and so Jim Clark would cut the muzzle end off of a decommissioned slide and weld it onto the end of a standard 5-inch government slide. After welding the new piece onto the slide, he'd then dress everything down, blend it back together, redo the stirrup cuts or ball cuts if necessary, and refinish it. You can still see some discoloration where the two slides were welded together. This is because the weld material is probably a different steel than the slide, and it probably reacted to the heating and cooling cycle slightly differently. And of course, there is also the heat affected zone of the slide. All of these areas of steel with slightly different attributes can cause the metal to react in slightly different ways to the bluing salts. Moving on to the sights, one thing that was found out pretty quickly with GI 1911s is that a common failure point was the tenon front sight. It had a tendency to loosen up and eventually eject itself from the pistol. The tenon front sight essentially has a small stem that extends through the slide and is peened over on the underside to retain it. The tendency to loosen up was especially true when a high round count was achieved, like one could expect from a serious competitive shooter. Also, the larger, fatter, Patridge-style front sights that bullseye shooters prefer had an even greater tendency to do this due to having more mass and thus more inertia. The solution to this was to affix the sight by other means, usually by increasing the contact patch between the front sight and slide and then silver soldering it all in place. Here you can see that's exactly what Jim Clark did. The front sight, which is quite big and heavy, has been set into a milled slot to increase its contact patch with the slide and then silver soldered in place. Moving to the rear sight, we have a Bomar tuner rib. These are drilled and tapped into the slide, and you can see the Allen screws used to affix it right on top. The cool thing about this specific rear sight and why it's called a tuner rib is because using these set screws, you can adjust the angle of this forward piece, and you can see that it actually impinges on the top of the barrel hood and can be used to adjust your vertical lockup. The barrel tuner is super cool. It's real old school accurization tech. This sort of thing isn't really used by any current bullseye smiths that I know of, but this is one way that gunsmiths were trying to get every bit of accuracy out of their 1911s by improving their barrel fitment. It's also just a really good adjustable rear sight like Bomars typically are. It's got a great sight picture, it's got very fine adjustments with positive clicks, black on black the way all sights should be. The original Bomar company isn't in business anymore. It was basically a mom and pop shop and it folded once they got elderly, but we still use the term Bomar to describe this entire category of sights and the type of cut used for the more typical Bomar rear sight that you're used to seeing. Another really cool signature Jim Clark feature on this gun is his famous tiger tooth stippling on the front strap. These Colt 1911 frames were dead soft, and that allowed him to create this pattern of sharp raised burrs. I've been told by those that met him that he used to use an old lathe bit, probably a little piece of high-speed steel that he shaped specifically for the task. In any case, this is a super aggressive texturing, more aggressive than any checkering I've felt. It almost feels like a small wood rasp. Jim Clark Sr. was one of the most influential gunsmiths in American history, and especially 1911 history. And it's such a shame that so few people recognize his contributions to the 1911. You go and watch most videos here on YouTube talking about the history of custom 1911s. Most of them start in the 1970s with Armand Swenson. Now, don't get me wrong, Armand Swenson obviously was an old school gunsmith that knew how to move metal. But as far as I'm aware, his major contribution to the custom 1911 world was the ambidextrous safety. Jim Clark Sr., along with many of those gunsmiths I mentioned earlier, like Giles, Shockey, the engineers at Springfield Armory and Colt, the Army Marksmanship Unit, and many, many more, all of these guys, they had to do the hard work of learning how to properly fit barrels and slides on a 1911 to make an accurate pistol, developing the proper metallurgy to create longer lasting parts like the National Match and hard slides, learning how to properly tune and profile extractors, learning how to do crazy things like weld an extra inch of slide onto the gun or chambering them in 38 special, and pretty much all of this was done from the late 1940s and into the mid 1960s, almost entirely in service of bullseye competition. And the more I look into the history of these things, the more obvious it is to me that bullseye has always been on the forefront of pistol technology and technique, right up to and including bullseye shooters competing with optics on their pistols in the 1970s, with the first national pistol championship being won with a red dot in 1980. So while I have your attention, let's learn a bit about Jim Clark Sr., because it's not something you're going to hear from Wilson Combat's version of 1911 history, probably because Clark Custom Guns was a competitor of theirs, and probably because Jim Clark Sr. mogs most of the guys who got big in the 80s and 90s. James Edwin Clark was born on February 15th, 1923 in Fort Worth, Texas, to a dysfunctional family situation. At some point, his family moved to Shreveport, Louisiana. Coming from a somewhat broken home, he naturally joined the United States Marine Corps after graduating high school. His recruiter lied to him. Clark had been told by the recruiter he would become a pilot. Instead, they shipped him off as a rifleman in 1942, just in time for the Second World War. Later that same year, Clark would undergo scout sniper training and would serve in that role with the 4th Marine Division on Kwajalein and Saipan. In one instance during the Battle of Saipan, he engaged an enemy formation at a reported distance of 1,000 yards with his scoped Springfield 1903. By the time the engagement had finished, he had fired over 300 rounds of ammunition. Clark would eventually be wounded on Saipan, leaving his left arm temporarily paralyzed. He would be discharged from the Marine Corps in 1945. Following the war, he returned to Shreveport, Louisiana. He got his first taste of bullseye competition in 1947, firing a bog standard Remington Rand 1911 with military issue 230 grain hardball. His first target he ever shot in competition produced a score of 78 out of 100 points at 50 yards. One of the cool things about bullseye is that we still use the same targets and same course of fire today as they did 70 years ago, and our scores are directly comparable. So with a USGI 1911 and hardball ammo, and this being his first target ever, that's actually really good shooting. Like, I don't even know if I could shoot that right now with my surplus 1911. From this very first match, Jim Clark was hooked on bullseye, so he borrowed some pistols from a friend, and in just 3 matches, he earned his master classification. In 1950, only 3 years after starting bullseye, he broke 2,600 out of a possible 2,700 points, which is the same standard 2,700 point course of fire that we shoot today. In doing so, he became the first civilian shooter to accomplish that and the 4th man ever to accomplish this. The best comparison I've heard for breaking 2,600 is this is sort of like the 4-minute mile of bullseye shooting. And since 1940, there are less than 1,500 names in the NRA's 2,600 club. In 1951, he was recalled into service with the Marine Corps due to the Korean War. This time, he was stationed at Camp Pendleton in California and spent most of his time working on pistols for Marine competitors. This was the first time he encountered a .38 Super 1911 that was converted to fire .38 Special, and after being discharged later that year, he returned to Shreveport, Louisiana. The first thing he did was he purchased 20 .38 Super 1911s from Colt, which he then converted to .38 Special and sold out of the back of the American Rifleman. This is where Clark's gunsmithing career really took off, and Clark Custom Guns would become a very well-respected name in the world of competitive shooting and pistol smithing. In 1958, Jim Clark would again make bullseye history by being the first civilian shooter to win the national championship at Camp Perry. He remains the only shooter in the entire history of bullseye to win the national championship that has never spent any time on a military or law enforcement shooting team. In 1960, he would become the first man ever and the first civilian to achieve a score of 2,650 out of 2,700 possible points. There are less than 170 people that have accomplished that feat since 1950. So if you think I'm a really good shooter, the closest I've come to that score is 2,603. So Jim Clark in his prime, or anyone on the 2,650 list, is going to be 10 times the shooter that I am, considering there's almost 1/10 the number of names in the NRA's 2,650 club. Clark would continue to compete until 1975 when he finally retired from the sport to focus on gunsmithing. That means that this pistol was actually built in the years when he was an active competitor, and it was built in Shreveport, Louisiana, which was the original location of Clark Custom Guns. By far, Clark's most important contribution to the world of 1911s, besides the invention of the 6-inch long slide, was the ramped 1911 barrel. A ramped 1911 barrel is pretty much considered a requirement today for many calibers that 1911s can be chambered in, like 9mm Luger and 10mm automatic. Today, the Clark Para Ordnance ramped barrel is one of 2 major patterns of ramped 1911 barrels and is used in many, if not most, 9mm 1911s, to include most, if not all, 2011s and double-stack 1911s. Another interesting fact about Jim Clark Sr. is that he is Jerry Michelick's father-in-law, and thus Lena Michelick's grandfather. I don't remember the exact details, but Jim Clark's daughter, Kay Clark, I think worked the front desk at Clark Custom Guns, and Jerry was a regular patron of theirs, or eventually even started working there or something like that. But that's how they got to know each other, and that's how Jim Clark became Jerry Michelick's father-in-law. You know, I always wonder the type of conversations that Jerry Michelick and Jim Clark must have had about shooting, because whenever Jerry Michelick boils down shooting to its most basic fundamentals, he boils it down to sight alignment and trigger control, just like any good bullseye shooter will tell you. Whenever he references Jim Clark in podcasts or interviews, he always speaks with a degree of reverence and respect towards him, even if he doesn't mention his name directly. And Jerry Michelick does seem to have a lot of respect for bullseye shooting, which is the attitude that anyone that's actually good at shooting should have. In the year 2000, Jim Clark Sr. would pass away, but he never lost his love and commitment to the sport of bullseye, the pursuit of marksmanship, or mechanical excellence. He made the trip up to Camp Perry for the national matches right up until his very last year, 47 trips in total, offering gunsmithing services while he was up there. Overall, Jim Clark worked on somewhere around 250,000 pistols, mostly 1911-related jobs. Clark Custom Guns would eventually branch out into all sorts of other pistol smithing jobs, but the 1911 pistol is where Jim Clark Sr. was king for many, many years. And today, we're still using 1911s with long slides and the ramp 1911 barrels that he pioneered. So that's pretty much it for James Earl Jones's 38 Special Long Slide 1911, built by the one and only Jim Clark Sr. It was designed for bullseye to combine the light recoil and accuracy of the 38 wad cutter with the self-loading and self-cocking benefits of an automatic. This pistol is going to have a part 2 that's essentially going to be a range report. Having 2 separate videos that are about 20 minutes each will probably be easier for most people to digest. If you like this video, you'll probably like my video on the Smith & Wesson K38. It's a very similar video covering the technical aspects of the pistol, its place in history, and my own competitive shooting experience with it. So thank you all for watching. Hopefully you learned something or at least saw something on your screen that was at least somewhat cool. Thank you especially to my channel members and Patreon supporters for supporting me directly. I recently upgraded everyone's loyalty icons. So thank you all for watching and have a great day.